if you look at how presidents of the United States will say, you know, I'm Irish, when they're 1/16th Irish. But what is the one piece, what is the 1/16th of their background that they hold on to? It's being Irish.
We are endlessly curious, I think, as a people, about other people from other parts of the world. Well, that curiosity we have about other people, we apply to people in China, we apply it to people in Latin America, we apply it to in other parts of the world.
Well, the Irish are seen as pretty neutral, and so therefore we're welcomed, and people aren't suspicious of us. And that helps when you're a scientist, because science is all about collaboration.
Everyone says it's a cliche. Everyone loves the Irish. They love the idea of being Irish. They love the narrative of the small, the little feisty country making good and fighting for its independence and so forth. It carries with it the rarest of qualities, and that is unequivocal pride.
I mean, Socrates is right, you know. All you can discover in philosophy is that you don't know anything. But when you start with that discovery, then you go looking. And what's wonderful is the pursuit of Irish identity, is the pursuit of what it means to be Irish. Because actually to be Irish is to ask the question, what does it mean to be Irish? That's the best thing about it.
What it means to be Irish has, of course, changed beyond belief over the last century. From an impoverished, colonised island on the edge of Europe to a confident, largely affluent nation taking its place on the world stage. In this series, we look at how this remarkable change took place and meet some of the leading Irish minds who are not only shaping this new Ireland, but also shaping the wider world about them. Ireland struggled long and hard for its independence, and once that was achieved, the land, which for generations had inspired songs and stories, became the focus. In the early years of the state, Ireland concentrated mainly upon agriculture, and apart from the constant drain of emigration, closed itself off to the outside world. Soon, that world was at war. The Irish government, however, chose to remain neutral. The period was both an act of self-preservation, but also an act of self-assertion, as Ireland took an independent path from Britain.
When I left school, it wasn't that very far after the war. So Europe was in destruction, was being rebuilt, reformed. At the time, emigration was the big issue. There were no real jobs in Ireland. So there was the sad scenes at the railway station every weekend when people had to leave the country. And I experienced that firsthand.
I mean, in some of those years, you know, 50,000 people were leaving this country annually, and we were only producing 60,000 people a year. So the hemorrhage abroad was terrible.
If you think back to 1952, $400 per capita was the GDP. $400. Very, very small country, very poor. One of the big sources of income was the remittances from immigrants that were sent back to Ireland to help support the people that stayed behind.
One of my earliest memories would have been in the late 50s. I was born in 1951, so late 50s. And definitely being aware of my parents. My father used to come home for lunch every day. He was in the civil service at the time. And of my parents talking about how bad things were. It's like a kind of a core memory that things were not good in Ireland and that things needed to be better in Ireland, and that we had a ways to go. My father's father had died when he was about 8 or 10, that kind of age, and there was no room for him on the farm. So if he didn't get a scholarship to university, it wasn't clear where he was going. So for him, education was a hugely important, if you like, focus in people's lives. And not just education by way of university education, but any kind of education and training. So he was very big into that. And my mother would have been somewhat similar.
a strong education system, largely led by the Catholic Church, would prove to be a core contributor to Ireland's long-term success.
My father was a very hard-working doctor, and he didn't take many holidays because he had 5 of us in boarding school at one stage. And that was, for any family, even with a reasonable income as we had, quite a sacrifice. And that idea of sacrificing for the education of children was true everywhere. I mean, at that time, that was the most important thing, because you probably knew, by and large, your young were going to emigrate, and they had to have the education.
In a knowledge-based economy, it's creativity in the long term that is the building block. And I believe if in a school, and I think this is the same today, if children came out with a sense of self-esteem and creativity, that's by far the most important thing.
It became obvious that emigration was going to be at least an option, was going to have to be an option for many of us. And I think, if I look back, I think all but 3 or 4 of our class did leave and went to the UK or Canada or the US. I remember well when I arrived here and to begin working at CHEVRON that I found that because of the strong education that I had both in Willow and Black Rock and then subsequently in UCD, I could outplay a lot of the people very, very quickly here, not just on raw ability, but just on the basic knowledge and information and training that we got back in Ireland. It was very competitive, particularly at the undergraduate level. I think we were producing engineers, scientists that were world class, looking back at it.
But back in Ireland during the 1950s, there was a growing recognition that a continuing dependence on agriculture alone could not sustain Ireland into the future.
My parents' generation were the generation who were young people when the state was founded, and they still carried some of the vision and the mission. And so the idea that, at last we have control of our own resources and we have to build our future on them was very much there. And our own resources were viewed solely as agriculture in those days.
As the 60s dawned, the divisive legacy of the World War and the ensuing Cold War were embodied in the construction of the Berlin Wall. But as one part of Europe was so dramatically closing itself in, there was a growing realization in Ireland that the time had finally come to open up to the wider world, and the walls of economic protectionism that had dominated Irish policy for so long must be torn down.
From an Irish base, our business was in contraction until Sean Lemass really saw the light about free trade and started to move in a very different direction politically. And it's really only from the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, that the evolution of the modern business in Ireland, I think, can be traced.
A hugely significant event in the 1960s was to cement Ireland's long-standing relationship with the United States.
I still remember when President Kennedy came to Ireland and the thousands of people that were out there, on the streets. That was kind of a reflection of the Irish view of America in the 60s. The view was a land of opportunity and one with which Ireland in particular had strong ties because of the masses of emigration that occurred.
Those strong ties that Ireland has enjoyed with the US were matched by strong links in Europe. And when the idea of a European Union was born out of the divisions and strife of the past, it was clear that a new, more outwardly looking Ireland would eventually play its part.
We had been tied umbilically to Britain for so long. Our economic policy in many ways was dictated by our British relationship. Our mentality was distorted by the British relationship, often by a sense of antagonism and grievance, sometimes legitimate, about Britain itself. And suddenly the opportunity we all saw in the 70s was to break away from this. It was a brave new world when we joined the European Union in 1973. A lot of us campaigned for membership of the European Union, and we saw this as an opening out of Ireland, an opening up of Ireland.
I would think that the politicians who led Ireland as an independent state to join the common market, they were in a way the people who led Ireland to real independence. Independence where you're still dependent on the people who originally were your formal colonizers, where you're still dependent on them economically, isn't true independence. The true independence was the independence that we gained when we had access to the European market and a share in the running of Europe. That really was the tremendous achievement.
I was troubled by a number of friends of mine who felt, look, we've struggled for our independence. Are we going into a homogenized European muddle now? But I really felt, and I think it has been the case, that we freed ourselves of that post-colonial negative link with Britain, which was dominating so much.
Suddenly, the sea that surrounded us was no longer a cordon sanitaire insulating us from evil influences, particularly British and continental, pagan, whatever, Protestant, atheist influences, but it was a waterways of connection.
There's a fear that if you open borders, just as there was a fear if you opened mines, that in some way it is threatening. I think that is quite wrong.
The world was changing rapidly, and the Irish seemed now poised to take their place on the international stage. The Irish mind, forged out of a tradition of education and imagination, was prepared to adapt to the needs of the globe. But was Ireland really ready to come of age? During the early 70s, a stormy period of economic and political instability swept across the world. A global oil crisis forcefully brought home to Irish people once again that their future was inextricably linked with the outside world, and that international forces, often completely beyond their control, would shape the destiny of Ireland in the coming times. As unemployment and emigration soared, it became clear that change was badly needed.
I'd been here in 1985 and I'd watched the country going into severe economic decline. And I remember very well that the debt to GDP ratio at that time had been moving towards 130%. We were in a situation then as a country where it seemed possible that the IMF would simply have to come in and take over government.
But 87 represented a very important watershed, and that was the agreement of the Tala Agreement, basically, that actually the opposition party would support the government in power in making difficult decisions.
The Tala strategy, whereby the opposition party, Fine Gael, essentially agreed to the reform package of the Fianna Fáil-led government. That essentially said to the world, you don't have to worry about who's in power in Ireland. They essentially will all follow more or less the same economic policies.
So there was really, if you like, indirectly a government of national unity, because you were actually saying, we're not going to fight you on a populist issue of making tough cutbacks.
For me, the biggest landmark really was the 1988 McSharry budget. McSharry came in, and that particular government came in, and he brought in the most draconian budget that you could have imagined. And I remember we started a campaign at that time, formed an Irish Committee for Basic Science to try to reverse those cuts. And I remember how difficult that was in the context of all these swinging cuts in the health service where they closed down wards and whatnot. How could you argue really support for education in that context? But the McSharry budget worked. Within 3 months, confidence began to return to the economy.
interest rates started to drop systematically and dramatically. And within 2 to 3 years, it was a very different country.
The industrial disputes that were endemic during the 60s and 70s and to some extent even in the 80s started to subside. And all those things helped the economy to grow and to become very competitive.
I was actually in Canada between 86 and 88, and when I came back in 88, there was a palpable difference. You'd meet people and they sort of said, yeah, we're getting it right. We're finally dealing with the problems. We've admitted to them. We're getting on with it.
What we were lucky to have all the way through, I suppose, was this well-educated workforce, which we have made a lot of noise about, which enabled the IDA with very specific targeting to attract foreign investment into Ireland. And that really has been, I suppose, the genesis of our development in a way. We've seen the indigenous sector develop since then, but the priming to that was done by the foreign direct investment which came in here.
Ireland had two choices. Do you raise the tax rate on the industries that benefited from the export tax policy, or do you lower the general corporate tax rate? And I think they did exactly the right thing in retrospect, to lower the general corporate tax rate to 12.5%, 13%, and it has stimulated an enormous amount of investment and growth.
In fact, quite a lot of Europe at that time was, struggling in different ways with the aftermath of the oil shocks of the 1970s, trying to bring inflation down to a low level after high inflation in the late 70s, early 80s. At that time, a lot of economic activity was really capital intensive, and Ireland was not really the place if you wanted to be, engaging in heavy industry and so on. So part of it was correction of domestic policy problems, such as the fiscal problem, high taxation and so on. Part of it is the world changed. So now when the world is much more engaged with information technology, knowledge society, and what became an issue was, is this an attractive place to produce? So can you get skilled workers to live there and work there? And also, is it attractive for businesses who make a lot of profits? And with the low corporate tax regime and so on, that was helpful.
I myself tend to think that for public consumption, the importance of joining Europe is constantly stressed, because we like to think of ourselves as very European. For one thing, it nicely differentiates us from those navel-gazing Brits over the water. But I think in terms of practical effect, the way that American capitalism colonized Ireland will look to future historians as at least as important and probably more important.
But behind the Iron Curtain, the old order of Soviet-style communism was on the brink of collapse. In 1989, a wave of revolution which spread across Eastern Europe would alter the face of Europe forever, and the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall would signal a new era in world affairs. In Ireland too, symbolic change was also underway.
Culturally speaking, a major turning point was, I think, the election of Mary Robinson as a symbolic and effective intervention into one of what seemed to be one of the most ossified parts of the body politic was astonishing, and which coincided at the beginning of the 90s with a great sense of liberation and things opening out.
Part of this change was that Ireland officially embraced its emigrant population across the globe. Ireland, a nation that had struggled for so long for its national territory, was now beginning to define itself more in terms of a people or an idea, rather than purely in terms of a place. The importance of the Irish mind came to the fore.
There was a real sense of the larger Irish family and the larger Irish nation, which was kind of a disseminated nation, and one which no longer worked according to the very tragic and sad and perhaps an ineluctable principle of a one-way ticket, in famine times in the 1840s and 50s and even after for several decades. Now it was at least a two-way ticket.
Ireland was on the move. The economy began to boom, and for the first time in Ireland's history, the thoughts and dreams of the emigrant generations would turn back towards the motherland. This further opening up of Ireland would bring unprecedented economic growth and social change in the decade ahead. In the next episode of The Irish Mind, we explore how the Irish embraced business in Europe's fastest-growing economy.
Because I'm based in the United States and talk a lot in the United States about human rights issues, about the need to address global poverty issues, etc., every time there is such an Irish component in the audience, and people come up afterwards and they don't want to talk about global issues. They want to talk about how proud they are to be Irish and Irishness. And quite a number of them have never visited Ireland. Or they tell me, I visited last year and it made such a difference to me. So that sense of Irishness is not in that sense diminishing, but I have a sense that they're proud of what Ireland represents now, and that pride is actually what Ireland has represented. So we're at a very pivotal point. Will that continue into a future